I've been attracted to the idea of seeing Brave New World on stage really ever since first reading it as a teenager. I think it's a book that so captures the imagination of a young person because it's about the way that we engage with those around us and how we conform to society. And I think what makes it a unique prospect for any reader and a uniquely theatrical prospect for an audience is that unlike the other dystopian work that we're now also familiar with from the latter part of the 20th century, work by George Orwell, Asimov, Huxley, Atwood, and so on and so forth. What you see in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World is a very open-armed piece of work that has a great sense of humour to it and a great sense of humanity to it. But you also see a piece of work that is less about the way in which Huxley, as a writer, is trying to prophesize about the future, and much more a piece of work that hypothesizes about how the future of science, medicine, technology, politics, economics might affect human relationships and human behaviour as we understand them today. So really, Aldous Huxley is not trying to create a kind of dreamscape of an imaginary future, but rather he's trying to put on stage characters, individuals from our world, and to really draw an audience in by humanising the characters that he introduces to us in his novel, taking us on a journey alongside them, and ultimately asking, would we do anything differently under these circumstances, and trying to reflect back at us the conditions of our own world by kind of taking them to the most extreme, the most grotesque, and that's kind of really where the satire lies, in his ability to quite brilliantly identify things in the world around him in the 1920s and 1930s, and indeed the world around us in our own decade today, that will be constants as well as things that will inevitably change. I find it a fascinating novel because I think that Huxley belongs to a very rare breed of novelists in that he's both a philosopher and also a storyteller, and he's determined in all of his work to really exercise strong arguments through the mouthpieces of characters, but he also believes that it's possible at once to both make a case and to tell a story. And I think that the quite unique achievement of Brave New World, amongst all of his other work, but also amongst the kind of literature of the 1920s, where we see a lot of kind of contrasting, contradictory ideas at play, is that he really is able to marry those things without the book feeling like it's too heavy on kind of didactic debate. It feels like a very light touch that Huxley puts a series of very complicated arguments across with. And so it's a piece of work that I think it is a novel that you can read straight through, and it's very, very grippy and very, very, very funny in the way that it engages a reader. But it's also a piece of work that's kind of gloriously hypocritical, contradictory and slippery, because he clearly had a very restless mind, and like so many authors in his generation, he was someone that had a magpie-like interest in lots of different philosophies and ideas, and lived in a time of enormous change where Europe in the post-war years, in the aftermath also of the Great Depression, was going through huge intellectual turmoil, and we saw governments and prevailing kind of belief systems, change year in, year out. So this is a man that clearly delights in both intellectual debate, but also lives in a very exciting and uncertain time that wants to harness so many of the different ideas of that time into the characters at the heart of his novel. As such, it does mean that the protagonists within the book keep changing, and we also see a storytelling that is restless and inconsistent, and so it's been a wonderful book, I think, to dip in and out of as well. And actually, whilst when I first read it, I read it straight through, and over the last few years coming back to it, I've done the same again. I found it very, very helpful in the work that we've done to support Dawn's process, picking it up and reading it a chapter at a time, and actually sometimes reading it back to front, because I do think that the way in which Huxley stitches it together is a bit like a kind of literary patchwork quilt. We've done a huge amount of research, and actually the hardest thing to identify has been where to stop researching a particular topic. We began by trying to understand better Aldous Huxley and why he wanted to write this particular novel. We then spent a lot of time getting to know the social and cultural conditions of the 1920s, the early 1930s. We wanted to understand much better the literature of that time, but also the politics, the technology, the science, the economics of that period. And we became really interested in the aesthetic of Art Deco, with kind of Keynesian politics, as well as a lot of the kind of complicated political structures of the House of Commons during that very divided decade. But then quite quickly we also realised that you could get really easily bogged down in those years at the expense of actually really what made this piece a very compelling piece of literature, which is that it's very modern and it speaks as powerfully to our own age as I believe it did to readers in Huxley's age. And so, you know, our kind of driving incentive to tell this old story in a new way is that we believe it can really kind of shed a kind of glaring light upon the way that we lead our lives today. And so we actually took an awful lot of the research that we'd done on Britain and America in the 1920s and tried to draw parallels with the kind of headlines that we see in today's newspapers. And we drew up great lists of the kind of parallels that continue to exist in the novel, and really tried to kind of focus our thoughts upon what story we wanted to tell, which themes we wanted to bring to the surface, and which we wanted to, you know, kind of delicately edit as well. Because I think it is fair to say with any old story, and particularly with something that was written almost a century ago, it's inevitable that there will be plenty of things that no longer feel relevant to modern audiences and no longer capture the imagination in the same way that they might have done when first written. And so Dawn has, I think, been very, very faithful to Aldous Huxley's vision and very true to his characterisation. She's very accurately taken the twists and turns of his plot, but she's looked to do so in a way that doesn't distract an audience by including elements that actually do now feel a little out of date to modern concerns. During the course of a research and design process, you kind of find yourself indirectly creating three lists. The first list is all of the things you know that this production should be. The second list is all of the things you know this production shouldn't be. And the third list is almost the most interesting, but definitely the most challenging, which is the kind of instinct list, all of the things that you sense that this production could be, that have excited you about the novel, and you know are unique to the adapter's voice and to the way that you like to bring a company together in a rehearsal room. And actually, so many of the elements of that third list are things that have really preoccupied us over the last 6 months. One of them is that Huxley, in his introduction to the novel, says that there are things in his world that literature cannot express, but he goes on to say that he thinks that music can capture a sense of the inexpressible, often better than language can. And that's why when Huxley himself recorded a radio recording of Brave New World, it had a full orchestral soundtrack. Now, we've always had a very strong instinct that the ceremonies, the rituals, the big set pieces of our stage adaptation should use music as a kind of key storyteller. But actually, we've had to make a coherent argument for why that's the case. It wasn't something that lived in our first list or our second list when we started the process. Next Monday, we'll be kind of saying to the acting company, here's a plate full of ideas, eat what you're hungry for, by which we mean we really want to be able to kind of toolbox to take into the rehearsal room that can ignite their imagination and enable them to hopefully engage with the material with the same kind of rigour and energy and enthusiasm and passion that Dawn and I have since we began working on the process. So quite a lot is actually less now about our vision for it and more about how we can facilitate a vision of both a creative team and also a company of actors. And it's really kind of exercise in simplification, because this is an incredibly complicated story that has so many kind of themes and ideas, but also tries to build so many parallels between the world of Huxley's Brave New World and the world of our own 2015 Brave New World. And so actually it's about kind of stripping it back to character, story, and the kind of you know, really central kind of ideas that we want to express in our production. I'd like to think that different audiences will come away with different responses, and that if we do our job right, we'll be really creating a sense of debate and provoking the way in which people think about how they lead their lives in a kind of different manner. I mean, I think it is about the relationship that we have to power and authority in our lives, whether that's in a broken relationship or within a dead-end job or within a community whereby we feel restricted or constrained or unable to fulfill our own potential. And I kind of think that, you know, we all have in our lives the kind of nagging doubt that we conform to systems and ideologies that we're not quite sure whether we trust or believe in, and that actually the achievement of a play like this can potentially be that it encourages an audience to walk out the auditorium and think, am I going to invest in that system tomorrow? Or actually, are there things about my life that I'm no longer going to submit myself to, but actually kind of claw back a sense of my own freedom and my own unique identity? I think that they should feel like they've been on a great journey and developed a relationship with a set of characters that has both helped them to understand you know, those people's stories, and that's a very eclectic range of different stories that you see in Huxley's novel, but hopefully has also shed a bit of light back upon the way that we do think about, you know, our own place in the world. So I don't think this is a piece that should leave an audience feeling emotionally cold. I think hopefully it's a piece of work which at times is a great tragedy, but also has real humanity and warmth to it. And you know, Huxley is of the firm belief that actually dystopia, looking to the future, is about positive thinking, because there's no purpose to you know, literary dreaming unless it's by way of trying to encourage a reader or an audience member to make changes to their own lives in a way that can make the world a better place. And the idea of dystopia is, of course, about avoiding pitfalls and speculating, hypothesizing what the world would become if we continue to let certain ideas go unchallenged. And what we hope in this production is that what we can hope to achieve is to draw an audience's attention to some of the things perhaps in our lives, in their lives, that we should be thinking more actively about challenging and standing up to. You know, of course, I also hope that at the end of an evening an audience would have been transported to another world, that they'll have been entertained, that they'll have been moved, but they'll have also seen a really unique, original piece of theatre that hopefully kind of really engages its company and its creative team in a way that showcases each of their respective skills to the very best of its ability.